Thank you, Demeric. That's very kind of you to say. I think Malcolm himself might be the world expert, but you know what? He has actually asked me a few things that he said I don't remember about that. So it's good. It is really great to be here at Demeric and with everyone to talk about the Bricklin, which is, as many of you know, a car that was built in New Brunswick, Canada in the 1970s. And in fact, this year is the 50th anniversary of the car's launch. It was launched in 1974, a half century ago in October of 1974, probably October 17th, 1974, in St. John. There were about 400 people working away in St. John and Minnow in the province in the midst of building the first couple of hundred of SV1s. And as many of you will know, that the quality of those first few hundred cars probably wasn't that great because they were trying to build them basically from scratch. There were a few problems, but they were still succeeding in building cars, getting them slowly but surely off the line. Since it is the 50th anniversary of the launch of the car, this is also the year, as Demeric pointed out, that my book has come out about the Bricklin, and I timed it to appear at the 50th anniversary. What I'd like to do today is to talk about Bricklin's legacy a half century on and how the car and the event is remembered today, not just in the popular memory and culture, but also by the people of New Brunswick and how this vehicle and the incident that's around it is thought about in the half century since it was first launched, because it does have a pretty interesting background and history, especially for the people of New Brunswick, who are the ones who paid for the car and built it. I've got an image here of the cover of the book, and I'm just going to juxtapose it since I'm talking about the past and today with a similar image of Malcolm Bricklin. This was taken a few months ago in May. We had an event at the University of Toronto, and Mr. Bricklin, as I often call him, was kind enough to come up and give a little bit of a talk about Bricklin, and we were able to get this really interesting image that is a kind of a juxtaposition of 50 years past. It's kind of interesting that Malcolm is still very active, as we'll talk about. So, in talking about the legacies of the Bricklin for the people of New Brunswick and in the popular kind of memory, I want to do three things today. The first part of my talk is going to be a very short version, a brief kind of synopsis of the Bricklin story to give everyone an overview or a reminder of what this is all about, how this car came to be, and why we're having a talk about it 50 years later, 2024, why there's still some salience in talking about the Bricklin and its legacy. Once we get through a little bit of a synopsis, the second thing I want to do is delve into the Bricklin legacy itself and consider some examples of the Bricklin's impact and how the car and the incident is remembered. And here I want to talk about a few kind of strains of the legacy of the Bricklin. I want to talk about the SV1, the Safety Vehicle One's impact in terms of its innovations and its impact upon the auto sector, because surprisingly, for a car built in New Brunswick, there are a few legacies in terms of the production and the design of the car. Some people may not agree with some of the interpretations and examples that I'll provide you with, but I look forward to hearing a little bit of engagement about that. The other thing that I want to talk about is I want to talk about the Safety Vehicle One, the SV1, as a living artifact, one whose legacy has a deep meaning not only to Bricklin owners themselves, but to Bricklin aficionados, fans, or simply car lovers who are taken with the idea of this man deciding that he wanted to build a car in the early 1970s and actually successfully accomplishing the construction of 3,000 of them. I also want to talk, as part of the living legacy of the Bricklin, about the broader meaning of the car in terms of not just how it has evolved, but also the idea of keeping the flame of the Bricklin alive for half a century, and how the flame of the Bricklin has kind of appeared in different forms and different types of cultural production. And, for us, it's very appropriate to talk about how the Bricklin continues to exist and it continues to be an attractive kind of idea and a car, given that our museum, the Canadian Automotive Museum, has our own Bricklin, Dr. Bigman's 1975 Orange SV1, which Demeric, I think, was donated to the museum, what, about 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, we
It's
got it in 2022.
in 2022. So it's a relatively recent addition to the collection, and my view, it's a pretty important addition, and it's one of the more striking additions to the collection. That 1975 safety orange SV1 has a VIN number of 2671, and all Bricklin owners kind of refer to each other by VIN number because there were so few of them made, as I'll talk about in a moment. 2671 means that this car was built towards the very end of the Bricklin's existence as a manufacturing operation and is one of the last vehicles built in the last 300 or 400 cars. The third thing I want to talk about, along with providing a synopsis and giving some idea about the Bricklin's impact as a living artifact, both in the industry but in the popular culture, the third thing that I want to talk about, and the final point I want to make, is that given that it is the 50th anniversary of the car's launch, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the broader meaning of the Bricklin. And in this way, I'm going to talk about the impact of the Bricklin on the people of New Brunswick, some of the people who built the car as well, and St. John. But I'm also going to talk about the Bricklin in the past and today, and especially about the kind of celebration of the Bricklin that I experienced just in August, this past August in St. John, when the Bricklin owners had their Bricklin International get together. So I'll be able to kind of juxtapose some of the ideas of what's going on with the Bricklin with what was happening just this past August and the past of the Bricklin. And I'll finally finish up by talking about what I think the wider historical meaning of the SV1 is, and what it means in terms of its broader impact upon our understanding of the evolution of the North American auto industry and North American society and culture itself. Which speaks to some of the themes of the book. And that's a little bit more academic-y in terms of trying to contextualize the Bricklin and root it into a story of not just New Brunswick and the people who built it, but what its broader meaning is in the larger story of automobility. And especially a transformation from a second to a third industrial revolution and a kind of changing dynamic in North American history around the early 1970s. The Bricklin appears at a time when there's a lot of social, cultural, political change going on in North America. And the Bricklin as a car comes to represent a lot of that change. And I'll talk just a little bit about this. Uh, so, one thing that I do want to mention before I kind of move on and get into the substance and talk about the synopsis is, how did I come to write this book? How did I get to this book? Which is, a question I often get asked, and I figure I might as well get to it early on. Why should I be spending a lot of time thinking about writing about and talking about the Bricklin? Because I have been working on this project, which, as I said, came to fruition as a published book this year, starting in 2007. So I've been working on Bricklin for a long time. And one of the reasons that I was drawn to the Bricklin and the project became so interesting and appealing to me, it's not just it's a pretty interesting car and a pretty fantastic car, is that I had been working on a couple of other books, and especially one book about the evolution of the North American auto industry. And Bricklin kind of kept reappearing as a unusual story, but one that had extra salience because of when it was built, where it was built, how it was built, and the consequences of its rapid rise and demise. I had used the Bricklin as a kind of example of post-war Canadian manufacturing in the auto sector, especially after the integration of the North American auto industry through the Auto Pact. And it became more than that when I started kind of digging into the Bricklin and thinking about it as more than just an example of post-war automotive manufacturing in Canada. It made me realize that this was a standalone story that had more than enough to be a book, and that it had a lot of really fascinating characters, an amazing kind of story. And most importantly, that because of when it was constructed and when the car company did go into bankruptcy, spoiler alert, it went bankrupt, that it could be used as a vehicle to tell a much broader story about the evolution of North America's economy, North America's auto industry, but a lot of aspects of entrepreneurship, culture and society, business, politics, promotion, all these different aspects that are so prominent in terms of how we think about the evolution of North America since the advent of automobility. And the automobile, because of its incredibly impactful role in society becomes such a kind of avatar for so many other things that are going on. And the Bricklin became that avatar. You could use it to talk about a lot of other things, which is what the book does. It talks about different aspects for those of you who haven't read it. And I'm not trying to sell you the book. I'm trying to explain to you why I am talking about this and how I came to talk about this. So, in 2007, I started working on the book. By 2013, I had my first interview with Mr. Bricklin, and I started working on it kind of earnestly on and off for years thereafter. And then I finally really started getting into it before COVID, but all during COVID. It was, kind of a COVID project, finishing it off. And then hence we have the publication today. Okay, I'm going to switch over and start talking about a little bit of a synopsis of the Bricklin. This is the cover of Maclean's magazine from November of 1975, just after the Bricklin company has gone bankrupt. And it is a striking image, and it's one of the reasons that I used it for the book cover as well. And it's Hatfield's Folly. With his brains and Hatfield's money, how could they go wrong? It was an article by Michael Enright, who ended up, of course, becoming well known as the CBC's host of Ideas. So the first line of Dream Car is in 1974, Malcolm Bricklin became famous. And I think most of you listening probably know the broad strokes of this story. But just as a kind of quick rejoinder, just probably 5 or 10 minutes, the story of Malcolm Bricklin and his fantastic car goes something like this. In 1973, Malcolm Bricklin was a 34-year-old American serial entrepreneur. He'd been born in Philadelphia, raised in Florida, and had kind of gotten into the business world in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, eventually settling on and becoming an automotive entrepreneur. In 1969, he had founded Subaru of North America and had brought Subaru cars to North America, had made some pretty good money, and eventually had used that money to take on the dream that he had kind of come to grips with in the early 1970s, his dream to build a sexy yet safe sports car, one that had gull-wing doors and that would challenge Corvettes and Mazdas and all these other cars that were entering the American sports car market in the 1970s. And he would do it from the angle of safety because safety had become a pretty important aspect of consumers' concerns since Ralph Nader had, kind of started the safety revolution. Now, starting a new car company, especially a sports car company, by oneself as an independent producer was a pretty risky venture. It's always been a risky venture. By the early 1970s, there are really only four car companies left in North America, the big three and AMC. And for Bricklin to try to achieve this dream of launching his idea of a sports car, this is an incredible risk, something that no American car manufacturer had attempted since the 1940s. And with good reason, they'd all gone bankrupt. People like Preston Tucker had tried to launch a car company, it had gone bankrupt. People like Henry Kaiser had spent $50 million trying to launch a new car company. He'd actually managed to get some production with the Jeep, but it had gone bankrupt. And now Malcolm Bricklin was trying to do it in the 1970s. And one of the things that he needed was investors because he had an idea, he had a car, he had a prototype, and he tried to sell it around North America. And eventually, he did run into and meet this guy, Richard Hatfield, who was the premier of New Brunswick. And he convinced Richard Hatfield to buy into his idea of this dream car. And Richard Hatfield was also a relatively young premier of the province of New Brunswick, which was effectively a pretty, rural province. It was a province that had an economy that was based on extraction primarily. Forests, Irvings were big, but he thought that this idea of a car that Malcolm was pitching him could be a dream for both of them. On the one hand, Malcolm had the design and expertise, he claimed, to build and sell the car, and Hatfield, for his part, would provide the financing, labor, and majority ownership to build the car in New Brunswick, where that manufacturing side of the operation would exist. And one of the key selling points about the car for both Malcolm as someone who's selling the car, but Hatfield, who was buying into the dream of the car, was its futurism. In the early 1970s, this was a period of a lot of futurism, a kind of a space age technology and an embrace of ideas about the future. We were going to the moon. Plastic was seen as a kind of wonder material of the future. And Bricklin had an idea of a really futuristic car, one that did emphasize plastic as the main material. No, most cars were built with steel, and Malcolm was trying to sell this idea of plastic. He also kind of emphasized the safety features of the car as futuristic. We'll talk about safety in a moment. But he also, probably most importantly, kind of designed the car to have a futuristic look. It was a very sexy, sleek automobile. And one of the most notable aspects of it were its gull-wing doors. There weren't a lot of cars that had gull-wing doors. The Mercedes 300 SL in the 1950s had gull-wing doors, and nobody had really tried to pull off gull-wing doors until Bricklin did so in the early 1970s, as we know others would later. But just as importantly for Hatfield, the futurism of the car wasn't just the design or the features. It was this idea of bringing automobile production to New Brunswick and automobile production as a kind of representation of the second and eventually the third and fourth industrial revolutions was something that was really appealing to politicians all around the world. Most industrialized countries had automobile industries, and this was a really attractive idea to bring car production to New Brunswick to make a successful car industry, which would vault New Brunswick into the future, so to speak. And Malcolm was a very good salesman. He was really good in terms of promoting the car. There was lots of publicity. Malcolm appeared on all kinds of television shows. When they had a prototype of the car, it appeared on, Let's Make a Deal and The Price is Right. Malcolm was on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, on The Today Show. He was really effective at promoting the car, and he generated a lot of enthusiasm and publicity for the car. The car appeared on all kinds of shows and magazine covers. It was featured in Car and Driver. It was featured in Road and Track. And he was really good at selling the idea of this car. By 1974, he had signed up 300 dealers, and they had accumulated 46,000 orders for Bricklins, which, we're going to challenge a Corvette. The cover here is Bricklin or Corvette. The subtitle is The Answer May Surprise You. And in the magazine's pages, they actually said, Bricklin does pretty good against Corvette. It probably is comparable, if not better, which was kind of surprising for a new vehicle. Now, unfortunately for Malcolm and for Richard Hatfield, launching a new car company in the early 1970s was an inauspicious time. This is not a good time to launch a vehicle. There's all kinds of challenges in the automobile industry. There's all kinds of regulations like safety regulations, fuel economy regulations, emissions regulations. One of the reasons they have fuel economy regulations was because in 1973, as we all know, the OPEC oil embargo really strikes a real blow to the North American economy by jacking up prices for cars. And there's lineups for gasoline across the United States, not so much in Canada. But this is a bad time to launch a car at a time of a lot of economic disruption globally in North America, and in a period when it's a lot of economic uncertainty and the economy is about to go through a really difficult time. Nonetheless, despite all these challenges, Bricklin manages to get into production, and they are building cars in starting production June, eventually getting right into production in September. And they built cars from September of 1974 right up until 1975. And they managed to build about 3,000 cars. Here's an image of the assembly line here in St. John, where the main assembly plant was. And in the year and a half while they were in production, they did manage to, as I said, build 3,000 cars. The car was aesthetically pleasing. It had great marketing. It sold a lot. It was sold out to dealers even before any car had rolled off the line. But there were lots of problems. The car had a lot of production problems in terms of the quality of the vehicle, actually manufacturing the vehicle. No one in New Brunswick had ever built a car before. And while Malcolm's team had a lot of car industry veterans, it was still hard to teach the process of building cars. Building cars is probably one of the hardest things humans do in a mass production idea. It's why there's so few car manufacturers left. It's why they're so hard to do. It's why people like Elon Musk, when he becomes successful, hits the jackpot because it's really, really hard to do. Nonetheless, despite his best efforts at production, there were cars that were coming off the line. Unfortunately for Malcolm, all of these cars cost much more to build than the price that they initially were trying to sell them at. And the cost of the vehicle in an era of inflation went up from $6,500 to $7,500. So by the time the Bigman car is purchased, that when the one that comes to our museum, it was selling for like $10,000. But even then, each car that's coming off the line costs like $16,000, $14,000. They're losing money every time. And one of the key reasons they're losing money is because it's so hard to build them, and they're having such difficulties with the doors. The most interesting feature of the car actually becomes the biggest problem in the car. And Malcolm would tell you even today that 90% of the production problems were really because of the vehicle's doors. Now, as many of you know, eventually the cost of the venture just got too much for the province. And after pouring 25 million into the car company, Richard Hatfield decided to pull the plug, and the car company went bankrupt. It goes down in history, in some ways, as a legendary flop, a terrible vehicle, a kind of Edsel for the 1970s. And just as importantly, the demise of the car company becomes a cautionary tale for state intervention, the kind of idea of governments providing funding to support car companies and having ownership of car companies or these kinds of high profile ventures becomes a problem. And Hatfield had tied his electoral fortunes to the Bricklin. In 1974, he ran on a campaign during the campaign called the Bricklin election, in which he promised the Bricklin as being a kind of panacea to the economic problems of New Brunswick. In any event, Bricklin does go bankrupt, and Hatfield is left with years of political difficulties, even though he is reelected. For his part, Malcolm actually survives the bankruptcy, one of a number of bankruptcies that he goes through, and he returns. The Bricklin gives him enough credibility, as does the Subaru operation, for a career in automobile entrepreneurship and other types of entrepreneurship. So he goes into marketing and importing Italian cars in the 1970s. He brings the Yugo to North America in the 1980s. He gets into electric bicycles in the 1990s, way ahead of everybody. And in the 2000s, he gets into trying to import Chinese cars into North America, again, way ahead of everybody. And to this day, he has his own car company still, which is trying to produce an electric vehicle. That's the story of Bricklin in a nutshell. So let's talk a little bit about legacies. And again, I'm showing you an image of this is the image that I used for the cover. This is the untexted image of the cover. Since this year marks 50 years since the car's launch, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Bricklin's legacy and how it has been remembered over the last century, half century, I should say. We'll see how it's remembered in a century from now, but I probably won't be around. For those of you who have read the book, you'll recognize some of the points that I'm talking about are part of chapter 7, which addresses both the demise and the bankruptcy of the Bricklin, but also spends some time talking about rebirth. And in that section of the book, I examine both how, on the one hand, Bricklin was conceptualized as a failure in the political and public discourse, and how it became a kind of cautionary tale of demise and the kind of story of Bricklin being a problem and an issue and an avatar of a failure. But on the other hand, I also address how the Bricklin lives on and continued to live on in ways that were somewhat at the time underappreciated and are probably still underappreciated to this day, and the longer term legacies of Bricklin. So, for instance, in the book and today, I'm making the case that some of the SV1's features and innovations have, in fact, become standard aspects of the auto industry, whether this is conscious on Bricklin's part or not. There's no question that some of the features, some of the design features, and some of the production aspects of the Bricklin live on to this day, long after the Bricklin was no longer being built. And probably the most important and prominent feature is, of course, safety. It's in the title of the car. It's in the name of the car. It's a safety vehicle one. And in the context of the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Malcolm was dreaming about his car, safety had become a major issue for consumers after the revelations of Ralph Nader and the Corvair and unsafe at any speed. And he wanted to combine a sexy vehicle with a sporty but safe vehicle. And some of the features that are in the car, such as a roll cage, extended bumpers, and even the gull-wing doors, he claimed that the gull-wing doors were a safety feature. But some of the kind of standard features of building the car to specifications that were even more rigorous than some of the speed bump specifications in the early 1970s really were innovative and really showed a kind of vision that Malcolm had about the importance of safety. And I make the case today that safety became such a defining feature of automobile manufacturing and automobile sales that we almost don't even realize how unusual focusing upon safety was in the 1970s as a feature of your car. Volvo obviously focused on safety. In the 1950s, Ford focused a little bit on safety, but Malcolm was the first person to really make safety a central feature of the car. And if you look at ads today, you look at the way cars are manufactured today, you look at the impact of safety requirements and safety demands on automobiles today. It's clear that safety became and remains a kind of compelling aspect of the legacy of Bricklin as something that is part of a lot of the auto industry. It's standard. The other thing that Bricklin utilized as a kind of futuristic feature that has become, I think, a pretty standard practice and a standard feature of automobility and auto manufacturing today was plastic. This is an image here of workers at the Minnow plant, which was the secondary plant in a little bit further north from St. John in New Brunswick, where a lot of the die casting for the acrylic and plastic that were bonded onto the vehicle were made. This is, I think, this is where the battery or one aspect near the side of the engine was kept. But, Bricklin wanted to utilize plastic for both reasons that were futuristic, but also, as I'll mention in a moment, to kind of save himself some money. Plastic was unusual in the early 1970s. There were a few cars that utilized plastic. There was a Renault. Of course, the Corvette in the early 1950s had utilized plastic, but Bricklin was one of the first people to really embrace plastic as a central feature of the car. Most cars were still steel, chrome bumpers, not plastic. And he utilized plastic both inside as a sheet, outside as a sheet of the car, but also inside in the car's interiors. And in the promotional materials, plastic became something that was really featured as an important design aspect of the car. We know today that plastic is everywhere in the automobile industry and in cars, and that plastic is such a profound part of automobility that the plastic industry kind of grew up besides automobiles as a kind of offshoot of the petroleum industry, but had so many applications in automobility that it became a kind of central feature of the automobile industry and its uses. So in that regard, Bricklin was very visionary, and the legacy of the car in terms of plastic is one that continues on to this day. Now, I did mention the gull-wing doors. The gull-wing doors did and did not become a legacy of Bricklin and his design. As many of you know, gull-wing doors did not become all that common for ordinary cars, but they did become a feature of a couple of important cars. One, of course, is the DeLorean DMC, which was built in 1981 and also boasts gull-wing doors. And I mention this specifically because the DeLorean is a great example of the legacy of the Bricklin. The Bricklin finishes production, stops being produced in 1975. DeLorean is produced in 1981, and DeLorean shares a lot of similar features of Bricklin, in part because Bricklin and DeLorean knew each other. Bricklin tried to hire John DeLorean at one point to run the car company, and they had talked about, ways of building cars. And one of the things that Bricklin had said to DeLorean was like, you got to avoid trying to paint your cars or use stamping, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is why the DeLorean is stainless steel, no colors. You got to have gull-wing doors because it's a really sexy, appealing feature of your car that will stand out in the marketplace, which is why DeLorean has gull-wing doors. And you got to build it in a place where you can get government support and wage rates are going to be a lot cheaper off the beaten track. Bricklin is built in New Brunswick. DeLorean is built in Northern Ireland. Of course, as we all know, a DeLorean faces the same fate as Bricklin. It goes bankrupt after 9,000 cars. And in the 1980s is even more notorious than Bricklin because, of course, John DeLorean is busted for drug trafficking in an effort to keep his car going. But the DeLorean, its legacy is saved by the Back to the Future vehicles. There's also one other a car manufacturer that has used a gull wing or falcon wing doors, which is, of course, Elon Musk, who has used the gull wing doors on the X or the Y. X or Y? I can't remember, one of the two. Now, another key legacy of the Bricklin firm was that some of their production processes were by necessity innovative for the early 1970s. For instance, by design, Bricklin attempted to avoid stamping and painting of body panels, which are the most complicated and expensive processes in car making, which is why he used acrylic and a fiberglass and didn't have stamping. But he did utilize modularization as well. And modularization is a kind of practice that goes back to old Detroit and is very common today, where you basically source whole subassemblies from off-the-shelf manufacturers. And Bricklin was doing this. Most of the car was in fact built from subassemblies and used off-the-shelf parts from General Motors, AMC, Chrysler, whatever. The only thing that Bricklin was doing was really building the frames and the body panels. So what he was doing was a kind of reverse of Body by Fisher, where he'd insource almost all of the car and just do the body and the frame himself. In a different era, Fisher Body would build body parts and sell to the manufacturers who would do everything else, including the engine. So this was a kind of role reversal in the way that the production process were going, and it very much kind of reflects the way cars are made today in a lot of ways. The other thing that Bricklin was doing in the 1970s is he was using a kind of just-in-time manufacturing process where he would be getting his parts as quickly as he could in small batches from across North America. Remember, after 1965, the Auto Pact integrates the North American auto industry. And the Bricklin Car Company is basically the first car company in history that is built and designed to take advantage of cross-border trade in parts. So here are a bunch of engines that are coming from, originally he got his engines from Chrysler, from AMC from the United States, and then he switches into getting his engines from Windsor, Ontario. Sorry, my apologies. It's the Windsor engine that's built in by Ford in Essex, Ontario. In any event, it's important to recognize that Bricklin's a pioneer in utilizing a kind of rudimentary, just-in-time cross-border, really a tight supply chain inventory process. It doesn't work for him because he can't manage it as well. He's not able to do so, but it very much kind of pre-visions what a lot of the auto industry is going to do going forward. The last thing I want to say is one of the key things that Bricklin does is that he doesn't even try to build an engine. He insources the engine, which is a production process that we're kind of familiar with in the 21st century, because in the EV revolution, oftentimes the battery, which is the engine of a new car, is coming from a different manufacturer, which has separated the kind of age-old practice of the big three and other major manufacturers building their own engines, which is oftentimes the heart of a car. Well, Bricklin didn't even try to build his own engine. It was far too technologically difficult for him. So he insourced it. He bought it off the shelf. Elon Musk, when he first started building the Roadster and the S's, he did the same thing. He got his batteries, he got his engine from Panasonic, and then I think from CATL, from others. So again, Bricklin, the legacy of Bricklin is visionary in terms of seeing how things are going to develop in the future. Perhaps just as importantly, despite the bankruptcy and the poor quality, Bricklin did manage to get the car built. And he built 3,000 of them, which meant that there were tangible artifacts of his idea of his dream car in the world. He actually made it come true. And over time, since 1975, because the car does exist in the real world, Bricklin became a kind of automotive folk legend, one that really led to the commemoration and celebration of his cars. Over the last half century, the car has been memorialized in all kinds of different ways. I mean, a stamp is created by the government of Canada, pretty good for a failure that cost taxpayers $25 million. It's been put on a coin, the Canadian $20 coin. It's has its own magazine. There's been songs. There's even been a musical about the Bricklin. So the Bricklin as an artifact has had this long kind of life that lasted far longer than the actual car company. And as a tangible artifact, Bricklin people love their cars. The Bricklin group, the Bricklin owners and people around Bricklin, it's a car club that's been going on for almost half a century, and it really does reflect the kind of living legacy of the fact that this car existed and it has its own kind of a long-standing connection to the people in the world because it did end up existing. Okay, for the last few minutes of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about the more recent kind of legacy of Bricklin and connect it to New Brunswick and the plant and the 50th anniversary. This is an image of New Brunswick workers building the SV1. And you see it's a rudimentary plant. It's got young workers who are really reflective of the early 1970s in New Brunswick and in North America. They're baby boomers who are building cars and trying to grab the future. I want to talk about the impact of the SV1 in New Brunswick, both in the past and today. And it's clear that despite the fact that the car was a failure, 50 years later, the more I think about it and the more I talk to people and the more I realize it, the idea of failure is pretty far from a lot of New Brunswickers when they think about the car. They think about it in retrospect as something that's pretty amazing, that it was an accomplishment that said something about New Brunswick. Even when the car was being built in the mid 1970s, and in the first years after its demise, by the end of the 1970s, New Brunswickers had an understanding of the outsized impact of this incident. And I want to give you a couple of quick examples of what I mean from the book. And these are quotes from newspapers and quotes from a poem that are from ordinary New Brunswickers and reflect ordinary New Brunswickers' idea of just how important this vehicle was. This first is from a poem from 1975 by someone by the name of Bricklin Booster, who, even though the debate is raging in 1974, 1975, of whether or not this is a good idea, whether or not Bricklin is a real entrepreneur or a con artist, whether Richard Hatfield is being taken for a ride, there are a lot of people who are very, very supportive of the idea of Bricklin, including people who wrote poems about it. This is a poem, not a very good poem. The promises Hatfield made us, he fulfilled them every one. And if they give him half a chance, the new ones will be done. And if you are so worried about our province, dear, just put your shoulder to the wheel and help him with this deal. Bricklin Booster wrote to a letter to the editor where they said, no matter what happens with the Bricklin, no matter what happens, no matter what anybody says, Malcolm Bricklin, Richard Hatfield, and the SV1 have made St. John the most publicized city in North America these days. So obviously, there's a bigger meaning going on here. Now, you fast forward to after the car has collapsed and the car company has collapsed. A reporter from the Financial Post, a reporter by the name of Robert Perry, in 1979 wrote an article about the fact that busloads of New Brunswickers were going on tours of the remnants of the Bricklin's production facilities to check it out. They were viewing the vestiges of Bricklin with a degree of fascination, but this was far from a lament for the SV1's demise. This is what Perry wrote. He said, all these people who are going to look at the plant and think about the Bricklin, talk about, all these people aren't demonstrating a mere morbid curiosity like bystanders at a horrible accident. They're saying something. And what they're saying goes like this. We did it. We built sports cars that people want. We have the heads and the hands to do that. We proved a lot to ourselves that in that ordinary looking little factory, and it's a shame we're not making sports cars right now in that ordinary little factory. To those people, the Bricklin venture isn't a symbol of failure. Why, damn it, it's a badge of ability. And, in retrospect, this idea really kind of has taken a little bit of hold in New Brunswick. And I really got a sense of that when I visited New Brunswick in August to go to the St. John plant, to go to the Bricklin 50th anniversary, and to, connect with a lot of these Bricklin people. There were all kinds of events involved in this. And one of the great things that happened along with the Bricklin get together was that the owners of the plant currently, Clough Canada, which is a plant that makes fire hydrants, put on a really big event. They opened up the plant to people. They had a whole T-shirt giveaway. Amazingly, they invited all the Bricklin owners to come that day. They had an open house, and dozens of Bricklin owners came. So did the Corvette Club of St. John and New Brunswick. And it was a kind of a fascinating moment to see the legacy of the Bricklin and to meet with people who were not only Bricklin owners, but to also meet with people who built the car. The people who owned the plant went as far as to celebrate the memory and the legacy of Bricklin by dedicating the plant as the Bricklin building, commemorating the innovation and design of the Bricklin SV1 manufactured here from 74 to 76. I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement of the legacy of this vehicle. And as I mentioned, there were also a number of plant tours. I had the pleasure of meeting a whole bunch of former Bricklin employees. It's an image of inside the plant. I showed you guys some images earlier. It hasn't changed that much. This is the track here that the Bricklin assembly line ran. They put some images, blow-up images of what the plant looked like. And these workers were kind of fascinated, amazed, and quite willing to tell stories about working at the plant, the kinds of experiences that they had. And there was no question that there was a pride to this and that there was a kind of a deep connection to this that really shaped their lives. That the Bricklin interaction had a profound impact, not just on them, but on St. John, on the province, and more broadly. Now, I'm going to make one more point about the Bricklin because I'm basically at 7:45 here, and it's a broader meaning, and it speaks to one of the main arguments in the book. Beyond all the local and national and personal discourse about the impact of the Bricklin, one of the key arguments that I make in the book is that we can use the Bricklin to see much of the 20th century. I say, if you get behind the wheel of a 1975 suntan safety vehicle, SV1, and you drive around and you visit all these different aspects of society, you can really read a lot into how North America was evolving. And the book is actually designed that way, where you can read it, the chapters in any order, because it's meant to be a journey where you take the car and you can go to chapter 5, which is about sex, or you can go to chapter 2, which is about entrepreneurship, or you can go to chapter 3 about safety. But behind all that is a broader argument about where the Bricklin fits as a contextual frame point for the 20th century. Bricklin's appearance in the volatile and disruptive early 1970s at a breakpoint of North American history and automobility is a real in-between moment. It's a real kind of like spot between Henry Ford's Model T and Elon Musk's Model 3. And, I'm making an argument where I say this one unusual car that's built, and there's only 3,000 of them, is actually a perfect way of kind of understanding that journey from Model T and automobility's rise to what's going on in the 1970s and its seeming decline and its rebirth in the 2000s and 2010s through the Model 3. If Dream Car is trying to convince you of anything, it is that the SV1 represents a transitional moment between these two different political, economic, social, and cultural eras, and it is a symbol of transformation across three industrial revolutions: the second, the third, which the Bricklin happens during, and the fourth, which is what we're experiencing right now. Since Malcolm Bricklin and his car firm were the only new American car manufacturing attempt between the 1940s and the 2010s, the SV1 sits in chronology and meaning right in between Ford's Model T and Musk's Model 3. It's a symbol of change and a symbol that speaks to a much broader legacy than 3,000 cars and an obscure firm that built cars in New Brunswick in the early 1970s. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions that people might have.
Thanks so much, Dimitry. I am obligated by the rules of museum professionalism and an angry private message from former automotive museum curator Alex Gates to state that our Bricklin was acquired in February of 2020, not 2022. My mistake. But let's get to questions. Um, Jim is wondering about the green Bricklin, and the car we saw in the photo at the very start of the presentation. Is that the same car that was famously given to Hadfield?
No. This one here, Hatfield never owned Bricklin. He was leased a couple of Bricklins during the election, and he always had a kind of a Bricklin at hand because he publicized that he would drive it around Fredericton. He especially drove it in the election. But the ones that he had a white one that I did have an image of that I didn't include, and he had a safety orange one, I think, but he didn't own either of those. And it's funny because at the Bricklin reunion in August, there's actually not a lot of green ones. There's like one here and one here because the green ones were the worst in terms of fading. They were the hardest ones to dye, the hardest ones to keep the color, and you can even see how it's kind of faded out. So there's not as many green ones left. There's a lot of white ones. There's not too many safety suntans because they're kind of ugly. But there's a lot of safety orange. So no, that is not Hatfield's car. Though the government of New Brunswick did end up purchasing at least two Bricklins. One of them is in the New Brunswick Museum, and then I think one of them is in storage. And of course, the government of Canada has one in Ingenium, and we have one. And there are quite a few Bricklins out there. There's probably about 1,400 or 1,500 Bricklins still left on the road that function.
Mhm. I'm noticing the dramatic range in tones of color when you're talking about fading. There's some inconsistent oranges and reds in this picture.
Yes, yes.
That's
And
for
there's a
sure.
yellow over here. I mean, over time, because the company went bankrupt, everybody was just DIYing stuff.
Yeah.
This one's a silver one over here. Brooklyn didn't produce any silver ones. So a lot of people have taken them and, detailed them and personalized them in their own way.
Mhm. Lindsay's asking because you talked about sort of the Brooklyn influence on the DeLorean and even the idea of getting sort of tax cuts or financial support from the government. But was there any evidence that the government of Northern Ireland had seen the Brooklyn story and had taken any lessons from that in their funding of DeLorean?
Yes. In fact, the United Kingdom government had checked Bricklin out early on. They were aware of Bricklin as a failure. Aston Martin had come over, grabbed a Bricklin, sent it to England, and tested it out as to whether or not they wanted to take over the company after it went bankrupt. So there was a lot of British interest and British knowledge and awareness of the Bricklin. So even by the time that DeLorean goes to Northern Ireland, he says in his book, Bricklin was, this is the direct quote, he says, Bricklin was thrown up at us about 31 million times by everybody involved because it was the only other example of a car company that had been built and had failed. Nonetheless, the British government was very keen in Northern Ireland in Belfast, where they set up the company, to use automobility and to use the manufacture of the car to try to kind of break from the troubles. I mean, in the 60s and the 70s, Belfast and Northern Ireland is going through such a difficult time, sectarian violence between religious and ethnic groups. And they saw this as a potential way of, trying to solve some of those problems by having a car manufacturing company. They ended up putting, I think, at least 200, I think it was 200 million into the venture before it went bankrupt. Johnny Carson was an investor in DeLorean. Lots of people were. It was another attempt, and the British government was well aware of this, but they were still willing to try to do it because at the time, even in the 1970s, 1980s, there was still an emphasis on state intervention in enterprise, such as auto manufacturing. And the question just goes to show you how willing governments were still and are still today to provide funding for auto manufacturers. Here in Canada, as we know, we have given auto manufacturers, in terms of the EV revolution, I think $37 billion, or committed $37 billion to auto manufacturing. Whether you agree with that or not as a policy measure, there's no question that governments are willing to do it.
Mhm. Um, Jim and Marcella are mentioning some other sort of similar, thematically similar gull-wing cars. Of course, the classic Mercedes 300 SL, and the Saab Sonnet as an example of sort of a low production car with plastic components and outsourced components. But I'm gonna move to another question by Jim. Actually, that's a
Yeah,
great
what
question.
year
That's
is the Saab? What year is the Saab? I can't remember what year it is, but I think it's after Bricklin. I could be wrong.
Let us know in the comments, Marcel.
Yeah, let us know in the comments. Sorry, Demeric, I just want
No, it's okay. I'm moving on to a question that's actually a great question to ask. This is so simple. It's yeah. How safe was the SV1 actually? Was it crash tested?
It's a great question, and there's a chapter in the book that deals exactly with this question. How safe was it? It was crash tested. This is in an era before, where the safety regulations and crash test landscape are only unfolding. Bricklin sends two cars to a firm in California that does crash testing, tests it against a number of other vehicles, and Bricklin does pretty well. In fact, it comes out on top. The bumpers cut on top. Um, Bricklin is tested against a bunch of other vehicles in NHTSA testing. That's National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, and it does well against them. It's not like determinately more safe than other vehicles. It's a hook to sell the vehicle, but it's probably just as safe, if not more safe, than other vehicles. And in the Bricklin files, in the Detroit Automotive, in the National Automotive History Collection in Detroit, and in New Brunswick, there are tons of letters and testimonials of people saying, "Hey, I got into a car crash with a Bricklin and I got out without a scratch. In the other car, people were injured." And that's also mentioned in the book. So, I come to the conclusion that it's probably a little bit more safe than most vehicles, in part because those bumpers were above the standards of the day. So my answer would be yes, yes,
Excellent.
contingent, yes. I'm
Going
not an
back,
engineer.
yeah. Going back to the Saab thing, Marcel is saying 67 to 75. So a contemporary, somebody else was building plastic bodied cars.
You know, not in North America, they weren't.
No. Um,
I mean, this is a North American story primarily. So
mhm.
yeah, and I don't know what kind of production they did. I don't know if they were trying to do batches or whatever. Well, I'm going to look into that. That's a great point that raises. With these kinds of talks, you always get somebody, especially in automotive, who's like, "Oh, what about this? What about this?" I'm surprised nobody talked about Henry Ford and his soybean plastic car, which was there.
Ah,
And there's been others. There's been others. Yeah.
yeah. John's asking if you've ever owned an SV1 and I'll expand it. Have you driven one and what do you think?
No, no, but I have been in one. And the first time I was ever driven in one was in August, and it's okay. It's a rear wheel, big engined car from the 1970s, which is very low. And it would be fun to drive if you were really on a country road and you really wanted to just put the pedal to the metal and take off. But it's a 50-year-old vehicle. It's a 50-year-old vehicle. The great thing is, being in that car and driving around, you wouldn't believe what kind of a head turning car this is. Everybody, I get why Bricklin owners love their cars so much, because if you drive around in a Bricklin, people stop, people wave, people roll their windows down and say, "What is that car? Where can I get one?" Which is pretty good for a 50-year-old vehicle. And that was the first time I really experienced that, because I've always been looking at the Bricklin from the outside, and this was the first time I've been on the inside, and I've been driving around, and I was like, now I get it. Now I get the kind of appeal of this vehicle. It stands out. It's really interesting, and it holds up. 50 years later, the design is actually quite appealing
Yeah,
for a 50-year-old car. If you compare the Stingray, for instance, which is the contemporary, I think the Bricklin holds up pretty well.
absolutely. Um, Chloe is asking about the perennial gull wing door problem, and was there ever an attempt to switch to something maybe a bit less sexy but a bit more practical for the sake of making the cars work?
No, I mean that was the conceit of the car, and Malcolm talked about this all the time. At one point, he says those doors are sex; they're sexy. And Chloe will know this because she read a chapter today in class about this from the book. But they couldn't move away from the design of the gull-wing doors because it was so central to the structure of the vehicle. But it was so difficult to machine this, so difficult to get it to fit. And the first few iterations of the car leaked. If you drove the SV1 in the rain, it just filled up with water. The doors would die because they suck so much juice from the battery. SV1 owners had to, I should probably go to an SV1 here. SV1 owners had to kind of kick their way at the back door if the battery had died because you couldn't get out. You had to go back out the back hatch.
Yeah.
So, the car is not great in terms of what the gull wing doors provide. They don't ever move away from them. And to this day, the funny thing is, over the last 50 years, the car had really poor quality and it had a lot of glitches. But all of those have been resolved. So the Bricklins that are on the road today are actually in pretty good shape. The doors work amazing. There's been a whole bunch of patches that have been utilized to make the cars function really well. So all the door problems are pretty much solved now. And if Bricklin had managed to stay in business for 6 more months or a year, if people kept shoveling him money to continue to do so, which the car industry is the most expensive industry in the world, I think he might have solved these problems. I think he might have solved these problems. Thanks,
Speaking of
Chloe.
sort of hypothetical longer term Bricklin stuff, Clark's wondering, was there ever an attempt to work on a second vehicle or a sedan model or anything other than the baseline SV1? Other than that, I know there were a couple, I think, gold-plated ones, but serious
Yeah, the
attempts to make an
chairman.
SV2?
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons that Hatfield pulls the plug, in part because in 1975 the company's bleeding cash, and Bricklin keeps going back and saying we need more money, and they keep saying, well, why aren't you making money? And he keeps saying it takes a long time to make a lot of money. And to his defense, it took Elon Musk 15 years to make money with Tesla, and he spent probably at least $15 billion before he made money. It's really hard to do it. But in order to make more money and to broaden the product line, one of the times that Bricklin went back to Hatfield, he said, "We need to have a new vehicle. We need to have an additional vehicle. We need to launch a kind of a next generation of this car." It was going to be called the Chairman. It was slightly different, and that's when Hatfield said, "No way. I mean, you're not even making money now, and you want to launch a new venture." But Hatfield didn't quite understand the car business. Neither did Bricklin until he got into it, and the realization is it's really hard to have just one vehicle. Eventually, Bricklin's dream was to go into production and in the first year make 10,000 cars, the second year make 20,000 cars, the third year make 30,000 cars, and after that be up to like 40 to 50,000 cars a year of just the SV1, and then bring in new vehicles.
Mhm.
He only made 3,000 in a year and a half. So he just couldn't make enough money, build enough cars fast enough. The plant wasn't big enough.
Yeah.
So there were ideas, but the reality was far, far, far from achievable in that regard.